A wealthy man reclined in his Italian leather armchair, interrupting the hum of laughter and clinking glasses with a sharp command. Melody, come here. The 12-year-old girl looked up from the kitchen where she was drying her hands, still damp from washing dishes. She had been helping her mother, Elena, serve canapes to the well-dressed guests in the grand Beverly Hills mansion. Quietly, Melody stepped into the room, surrounded by men in tailored suits and women glittering in diamonds. Their eyes followed her, curious but dismissive, an expression she had seen too many times. Robert Blackwood, the Millionaire host, gestured casually toward the gleaming Steinway grand piano in the corner. "My friends are bored," he said with a smug grin. "Your mother says you play. Let's see what you can do." On the velvet sofa, his daughter Tiffany snickered. "She can't even read properly. How's she gonna play the piano?" The room erupted in polite laughter. Melody felt the heat rising in her cheeks, but stood straight, just as her mother had taught her. From the kitchen doorway, Elena watched with worry, lips pressed tight. But she didn't move. She knew the rules. She knew her place. "Come on, girl," Robert added, clapping impatiently. "Just play something easy. Maybe Happy Birthday." What none of them knew was that for 8 years, Melody had woken up before the sun to practice on an old, out-of-tune piano in an abandoned church 6 blocks away. Father Michael, who recognized the fire in her, let her in each morning in exchange for a bit of cleaning. Her calloused hands were not just from scrubbing their floors. Melody walked slowly to the piano, her sneakers squeaking on the marble. She sat, adjusted the bench, and laid her hands on the keys. Behind her, whispers fluttered. Robert sipped his wine, expecting a clumsy attempt. Tiffany raised her phone, ready to capture what she thought would be a joke. Melody hesitated. Then something changed in her eyes. A quiet resolve, the kind that only grows in people who've had to fight in silence. She scanned the room. Robert's mocking smile, Tiffany recording gleefully. The smug faces watching her like a novelty act. "May I choose the song?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Of course," Robert said with a dismissive wave. "We're just here to enjoy ourselves." He had no idea that while he slept in his custom bed, Melody walked through the dark each morning to practice. He didn't know Elena spent her last dollars on secondhand sheet music, hiding it like it was contraband. He didn't know Melody practiced silently at night, fingers dancing over an imaginary keyboard while listening to music on a phone they'd found in a dumpster and patched back to life. Tiffany laughed again. "This'll go viral. Maid plays our $200,000 Steinway." "250," Robert corrected. "But who's counting?" From the kitchen, Elena closed her eyes. Her daughter had a choice: play it safe, stay invisible, protect their jobs, or do something unforgettable. Melody took a deep breath. Her hands hovered over the keys with a precision that didn't go unnoticed. It was the same posture her mother had once shown her, back when Elena still believed talent mattered. "I hope you like Chopin," Melody said calmly. And then she began to play. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that fills a room before a polite round of applause. It was the stunned, breathless stillness of people who had just realized they'd made a massive misjudgment, but hadn't yet figured out how deep it ran. And in Melody's eyes, for the first time that evening, there was a glimmer of something unexpected, an unshakable self-assurance that made even Robert Blackwood shift uneasily in his imported Italian armchair. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drifted out of the Steinway, delicate and precise. And while Robert frowned, expecting off-key attempts and clumsy timing, what he heard was structured, intentional, and unmistakably correct. Not remarkable yet, but far from the disaster he was hoping to smirk at. "Well, at least she knows where the keys are," Charles Morrison mumbled to Margaret Sterling, both of them chuckling under their breath. Tiffany kept her phone raised, already composing the sarcastic caption, "When your maid thinks she can play classical piano." But as Melody's small hands continued moving across the keys, something subtle shifted. Robert leaned forward slightly, puzzled now. The girl's technique wasn't just decent, it was refined. Far too refined for someone who supposedly picked it up in some underfunded public school. What Robert didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that for 8 years Melody had woken before dawn, slipping out into the chill Beverly Hills morning to walk 6 blocks to St. Michael's Church. Father Michael, once a conservatory pianist in Bogota before leaving his stage career behind, had taken one look at the girl the first morning she begged to just play a little, and knew exactly what he was seeing. While Elena scrubbed the Blackwoods' bathrooms and polished their floors, Melody was learning the art of music on a dusty, out-of-tune 1972 piano with chipped ivory keys and a pedal that stuck halfway down. And more than letting her play, Father Michael taught her with the wisdom and precision of someone who knew brilliance when he saw it. Mia, he would say, talent doesn't come from your zip code. Discipline makes the difference. As Melody reached the emotional high point of the piece, a new energy swept through the room. The laughter had stopped. The phones had lowered. Now the music was no longer just correct. It had heart, emotion. There was vulnerability in her phrasing, strength in her restraint, and an unmistakable depth that could only come from years of silent perseverance. From the kitchen doorway, Elena watched through tear-brimmed eyes. Every subtle crescendo, every breath between bars, she knew it all. She had been the one to first place Melody's fingers on ivory when the girl was only 4. Before fleeing Columbia, Elena had been first violinist with the Medellin Symphony Orchestra, but her diplomas meant nothing in America. Her career was reduced to mopping floors and folding linens. Yet her love for music never died, and she passed that fire to her daughter in secret. In stolen moments at night, while the Blackwoods slept, Elena whispered lessons on harmony and structure, and Melody practiced her scales on an invisible piano drawn in memory, hands dancing silently above the kitchen table. Her entire $15 allowance each month went towards secondhand sheet music, tucked away like smuggled treasure in the cramped room they shared out back. Now, in the grand living room of the very house where they were invisible by necessity, Melody was reclaiming what they had been forced to give up. Robert shifted again in his seat. He had wanted spectacle, something to laugh about. This wasn't that. This was art, and it was making people feel things. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't wanted it. That was when the front door opened, and in walked Dr. Eleanor Vance, a renowned music critic for the Los Angeles Times, and Robert's guest for the evening's formal dinner. She paused in the foyer, her breath catching. The sound from the living room stopped her mid-step. With 4 decades spent traveling the world, listening to master pianists in Vienna, Moscow, New York, Eleanor knew greatness when she heard it. She crept forward slowly, eyes fixed on the 12-year-old girl at the piano. Melody's fingers moved with a sensitivity that only comes from years of silent discipline and a mind that lives in music. Her hands, still a bit too small for Chopin's larger chords, adjusted creatively, without losing any harmonic richness. "My God," Eleanor whispered. She wasn't watching a child playing a piece. She was watching a child understand it. Tiffany, still holding her phone, stopped recording. The mocking smile slipped from her face as she realized the room had changed. The laughter was gone. The sneers had vanished. People were listening now, actually listening, and some were even moved. "Daddy," she whispered, "how much longer is she going to play?" But Robert didn't answer. For the first time in his privileged adult life, he was being forced to confront the reality that he might have made a fatal misjudgment. Melody wasn't good. She was extraordinary, and everything in his worldview screamed that this was impossible. Melody neared the end of the nocturne, hands gliding with practiced grace across the keys, fully aware now that she had the room. Not just their attention, but their reverence. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that Chopin was only her introduction. Father Michael had once told her, when they try to reduce you to nothing, don't just show them you're capable. Show them you're unstoppable. Melody had something more powerful than classical training. She had something personal, something original. And tonight, she had chosen to share it. As the last notes of the nocturne rang through the crystal-lit space and faded into silence, Melody looked straight at Robert Blackwood. Her gaze no longer held the fear of a servant's daughter pulled into the spotlight. It held the fierce calm of someone who knew exactly who she was. "That was the warm-up," she said softly, adjusting her posture. "Now I'll play something I composed, with you in mind." The first notes of her own piece rippled through the air like a soft earthquake, unfamiliar and haunting. It wasn't Chopin. It wasn't anything those millionaires had ever heard. It was melody. And for the first time, they truly heard her. It wasn't just music. It was a voice, a confession, a cry from the depths of invisibility. What Melody played next was something the room had never heard before. A sound born not from luxury or privilege, but from pain, from humiliation, and from the relentless hope of a girl who had spent her whole life being looked through. The melody began in a whisper, delicate as Elena's footsteps echoing through polished hallways at dawn. Then it swelled, layered with the rhythm of a mother's heartbeat after 16-hour workdays, with harmonies that trembled like hands too tired to tremble anymore. Each note was a brushstroke in a portrait of struggle and survival, and Melody painted it all with sound. Her fingers, confident and fluid, drew Dr. Eleanor Vance closer to the doorway. "My God," Eleanor breathed, pulling out her phone to record without a second thought. In 40 years of critiquing concert halls and conservatories across the globe, she had almost never seen this level of compositional depth in someone so young. Robert Blackwood had stopped drinking. The glass of red wine hovered in his hand, forgotten. He stared at Melody, trying to process what he was hearing. This wasn't performance, it was testimony. This wasn't just talent, it was truth, and it was cutting through every layer of his assumptions like a blade. Across the room, Tiffany slowly lowered her phone. The video she had smugly planned to post was no longer content. It was a record, a documentation of brilliance. A girl, her maid's daughter, was composing and performing something more complex, more breathtaking than she could ever dream of achieving with all her elite tutors and glossy certificates. The music shifted again. Melody layered jazz harmonies into classical frameworks, something she had learned from Father Michael in their secret morning lessons. A fusion of eras and influences, restructured through her own voice. Elena stood frozen at the kitchen door, tears streaming, recognizing every change in tempo, every borrowed phrase. She had heard it evolve in pieces over months, always in fragments, always in silence. But now, in this space where they were never meant to be seen, it was complete. Their story, mother and daughter, woven into sound. Charles Morrison had set his whiskey down, forgotten. Margaret Sterling was leaning forward, barely breathing. Not a single guest moved. All eyes were locked on Melody, now approaching a crescendo none of them could have anticipated. Her hands, small but unshaking, launched into a blindingly fast passage. Technical mastery met emotional fire. It was the kind of performance only a handful of people in the world could deliver. And she was 12. The $250,000 Steinway, up until now little more than decor, was being played like it was finally alive. Eleanor Vance stepped fully into the room, disregarding protocol. "Robert," she whispered urgently, "do you know who that girl is?" She's my maid's daughter," Robert stammered, his voice suddenly small. "Robert," Eleanor said, eyes wide, "this girl, she's a once-in-a-generation genius. I need to speak to her. Immediately." The climax hit like a thunderclap. Melody channeled everything she had never been allowed to say. The humiliation, the erasure, the stolen chances, the mornings of frozen fingers on chipped keys. Every injustice became a note, every hope a chord. And as she played, Tiffany watched her own expression change in the phone's recording, from ridicule to awe, from entitlement to shame. She realized with horror that she had unknowingly documented the moment she was humbled in front of the world. And it was too late to take it back. The final section arrived. A movement inspired by Colombian classical traditions Elena had passed down in secret, late at night when the mansion slept. Melody's hands summoned rhythms and scales no one in that room could name, but everyone could feel. It was beauty born from struggle, and it demanded to be heard. When the last note hung in the air like a final truth, the silence was thunderous. No applause, no breath, just stunned stillness. Not because they were being polite, but because something fundamental had just been rearranged in all of them. Dr. Eleanor Vance was the first to break it, her hands meeting in slow, reverent applause. "Extraordinary," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "Absolutely extraordinary." Melody remained still, fingers resting on the keys, eyes fixed on Robert Blackwood. There was no triumph, no revenge, only calm, unwavering clarity. The kind of dignity that doesn't need validation. That piece, she said softly, is called invisible. I wrote it for all the people you walk past every day, but never truly see. Robert swallowed, his throat dry. For the first time in his life, he realized that he had turned someone exceptional into a party trick. He had tried to diminish greatness without even knowing it was in front of him. And now, there was no undoing that. Elena crossed the threshold without waiting for permission. She placed her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, her face streaked with tears, her posture tall with pride. She no longer cared who saw. Tiffany stared at her phone. Her heart pounded with panic. She had captured her own downfall, her own cruelty, forever immortalized in HD, and now the only question was, how many would see it? But Eleanor Vance had seen something else, something beyond the performance, a detail in the technique, in the phrasing, in the emotional language of the music. She looked at Elena closely. That name, Morales, the interpretation, the movements, it all clicked. This girl wasn't just a prodigy. She was the legacy of someone Eleanor had once admired, someone who had vanished from the international music scene without explanation. Elena Morales, Eleanor whispered under her breath. First violin of the Medellin Symphony Orchestra. Now I understand. And with that, the story of melody, of invisible, was no longer a secret. It was a revolution, and it had just begun. As the guests sat frozen, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed, Dr. Eleanor Vance stepped toward Elena with a gaze full of reverence, but also something deeper, an awareness that the evening had only begun to reveal its most astonishing truth. Elena Morales, she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of revelation, first violinist of the Medellin Symphony Orchestra. You disappeared from the stage 15 years ago, just after receiving the Latin Award for Musical Excellence. The room plunged into a silence so thick it felt like the air itself had vanished. Moments ago, Robert Blackwood had been forced to confront the painful realization that the young girl he treated as novelty entertainment was, in fact, a musical prodigy. Now he faced something even more unthinkable, that the woman who had cleaned his house, polished his floors, and lived in his shadowed margins for over a decade was one of Latin America's most revered musicians. Elena raised her chin slowly with the grace of someone rediscovering the voice she had buried to survive. Dr. Vance, she said calmly, the quiet strength in her voice unmistakable. It's an honor to see you again. Robert looked between the two women, his confidence hollowing with each second. You know her? He asked, the arrogance drained from his voice. Eleanor turned to him with eyes like ice. Robert, she said, you had one of the greatest violinists in the Western Hemisphere scrubbing your bathrooms. And your daughter, one of the most gifted composers I've ever heard, serving hors d'oeuvres to people who laughed at her. Tiffany clutched her phone tightly, the same phone that had just recorded the collapse of her privileged identity. The video meant to humiliate Melody now immortalized her own downfall. A tone-deaf, rich girl outclassed by raw genius. I didn't know, Robert whispered, stunned, realizing the scale of his failure. Of course you didn't, Eleanor replied sharply. People like you never do. You see uniforms, not individuals. You hear accents, not stories. You recognize privilege, not potential. The very next morning, Eleanor published an article in the Los Angeles Times titled The Symphony of Invisibility, How the Beverly Hills Elite Waste Genius. It tore through the city like wildfire. She detailed not only Melody's extraordinary performance, but also the societal blindness that allowed someone like Elena Morales to be overlooked for 15 years. Meanwhile, Tiffany's video exploded online, but not the way she intended. The hashtag #privileged girl gets so old became a trending sensation, garnering over 15 million views in just 2 days. Comments were brutal and unfiltered. Imagine spending $40K a year on piano lessons and still getting dunked on by a girl who practiced on a broken church piano. That's not humiliation. That's karma in surround sound. Robert tried to recover his reputation, hiring crisis managers and PR strategists, but the damage was irreversible. The Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra offered Elena a position as assistant conductor. The Curtis Institute of Music awarded Melody a full scholarship with room and board. Three record labels battled for the rights to record Melody's original piece, Invisible. Tiffany, unable to handle the public fallout, was quietly admitted to a rehabilitation clinic for nervous exhaustion, the polite term for a mental breakdown caused by social collapse. Her influencer career ended overnight. Sponsors dropped her, brands ghosted her, her name became synonymous with smug ignorance. Robert, once a celebrated figure in Beverly Hills' upper crust, watched his empire unravel. He lost business deals, friends distanced themselves. His social invitations vanished. No one wanted to be associated with the man who treated a musical genius like a cleaning lady. His 3 million contracts disappeared. His reputation tanked. His wife, no longer willing to share his shame, handed him divorce papers at a charity gala. And when he tried to sue Eleanor Vance for defamation, the court confirmed every word in her article was protected, truthful, and impeccably sourced. 6 months later, Melody made her professional debut at the Walt Disney Concert Hall, performing Invisible with the Los Angeles Philharmonic under the baton of her mother, Elena Morales, now fully returned to the career she was forced to abandon. The event was televised nationally and raised over $2 million for a music education fund for underserved youth. Robert sat in the farthest balcony seat, the only one he could still afford. As Melody played the final movement, she glanced briefly into the audience. Her eyes found Robert's, but there was no anger, only the serene confidence of someone who had transformed years of dismissal into a legacy of triumph. The message was unmistakable. Robert had tried to make Melody invisible to entertain his friends. Instead, she had turned that invisibility into a masterpiece seen by the world. True justice wasn't about destroying him. It was about building something so magnificent he would never be able to touch it. While Robert Blackwood faded into irrelevance, Melody and Elena forged a new legacy, one that would outlive prejudice, outshine arrogance, and inspire generations to come. 5 years later, Melody is considered one of the brightest young composers in America. Elena now leads the Los Angeles Youth Orchestra, offering free instruction to kids just like Melody once was, brilliant, unseen, and waiting for someone to believe. Tiffany lives in quiet seclusion, her once influential social media platforms abandoned, her name now a cautionary tale. And Robert? He finally learned the true meaning of being invisible. Not overlooked, but forgotten. Melody chose invisibility as a strategy. He earned his through consequence. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that genius knows no address, no skin tone, no social status, then subscribe for more stories that prove underestimating the wrong person might be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make.